This book is called Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, because it tells the acts of the Holy Spirit through the apostles. The book of Acts covers the period from the coming of the Holy Spirit to Paul's imprisonment in Rome.
We have lots of ways that we can travel today, don't we? We can ride a bike, we can drive a car, we can take a train, an airplane, a boat. There's so many different ways that we can travel, not just in our town, but around the world. Well, in Bible times, people usually either walk or they rode donkeys. And in our story today, in Acts chapter 5, we're going to talk a little bit about some travelers. So here we go. Well, we're skipping ahead. Jesus has died on the cross, he's risen again, and now he has gone back to heaven. And many people in Jerusalem had started to follow him, which was really exciting. So God's family grew. But following Jesus, there was a very dangerous time because of men like Saul. Saul was a Jewish religious leader, and he was very proud of the way he obeyed God's laws. So, because he was Jewish, so he did follow God's laws. He just didn't know Jesus. Saul knew about God's promise about the Messiah, and he was the one who would save God's people. He knew that. But Saul heard people saying that Jesus is God's son, and that got him really angry because he didn't believe that. Saul didn't think Jesus was the Messiah. Saul believed that Jesus' followers were telling lies, and that made him feel like he had to stop them. So no matter what he did, no matter what Saul did, it didn't matter because the good news about Jesus spread. It just kept going and going and going. More and more people believed that Jesus is God's son, and they joined God's family too. So Saul and his friends began to arrest people. Can you imagine that, being arrested for believing in Jesus? Well, it does happen in the world today, but it was really happening back then too. Many of Jesus's followers moved away from there. They needed to get away from the danger, but they did go ahead and spread the good news of Jesus wherever they went. And some went to Damascus, and it was a big trade city where a lot of people came in on boats and from all over the world. And Saul decided that he was going to go to Damascus, and he was going to stop these people. Well, Saul did get permission to arrest these followers of Jesus in Damascus, but soon Saul and his helpers were on their way, and they rode for almost a week on their donkeys. And when Saul and his friends had nearly reached the gate of the city, something happened. Suddenly, there was a bright light. Pow! Paul fell off of his donkey that he was riding, and a voice said, "Saul, why are you trying to chase me down?" And when Saul could finally talk again, because he just was so shocked, Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus. I'm the one you're trying to hurt. Get up and go into the city and wait there until someone tells you what to do." This was Jesus talking from heaven. He was talking to Saul. Then the light was gone, and the voice spoke no more. Saul stood up. He opened his eyes, but guess what? He couldn't see a thing. He was completely, totally blind. His friends led him to Damascus, to the house where they were to stay, and for 3 whole days, Saul did not eat or drink. Meanwhile, in another house in Damascus, a believer named Ananias had a dream. Now, the dream was a message from God, and God told Ananias to go to the house where Saul was and pray for Saul. Ananias couldn't believe his ears. He said, "Saul is an enemy. He's here to arrest us followers of Jesus." But God told him, "Go. I have chosen this man to tell people about Jesus." And even though Ananias may have been scared, he obeyed the Lord. And soon he was knocking at the door of the house where Saul was staying. Can you believe that? "Saul," Ananias said, "Jesus who spoke to you on the road, Jesus sent me here so that you can see and be filled with the Holy Spirit." As Ananias placed his hands on Saul, things like scales, is how they describe it, fell from Saul's eyes, and Saul could see again. And because of God's power, Saul now believed that Jesus really is the Messiah, God's Son. Saul was baptized to show he followed Jesus. The news of the powerful change that had happened to Saul spread through Damascus like wildfire. Everywhere Saul went, he began telling anyone who would listen that Jesus is God's Son. He began to preach in the places where Jewish people gathered, and everyone who heard Saul preach were amazed. Here was the man who had wanted to hurt God's family, and now he was telling people the good news of Jesus. Jesus' power got Saul's attention. Suddenly, Saul knew that he was not in charge. Jesus was. And when Saul believed in Jesus, his whole life changed. He loved Jesus. And when he told others the truth about Jesus, it would change their lives too. You know, the sun is one of the most powerful things we can see with our eyes. And we know that God made the sun. And many other even larger and more powerful stars out in space. Did you know that God's power is even more than all of those put together? And just as Saul, later called by his Greek name Paul, saw God's power and acknowledged that Jesus is God's Son, we can see God's power and acknowledge him too. One way we can see God's power is when we see people acting differently because Jesus has forgiven them. We also see God's power when he answers our prayers.
First John 4:15. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in him and he in God. First John 4:15.